Have you ever wondered what can happen while driving alone at night on a deserted road? In today's video, we're going to explore 7 scary horror stories based on real accounts that will make you think twice before getting behind the wheel at night. So, get ready for some chilling moments, and before we start, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Let's go? 1. The Man with the Lantern. It was a cold, deserted night on a country road outside Galway, Ireland. Liam, a young driver returning home after a long day at work, was driving along a winding road shrouded in mist. Darkness seemed to engulf the world around him, and the only company was the car's headlights illuminating the uneven tarmac. The radio squeaked with interference, and he decided to turn it off, letting the oppressive silence take over. As he drove, something caught his eye ahead. A dim light flickered on the side of the road. As he got closer, Liam realized it was a man holding a flashlight. He was standing still, his arm raised as if to ask for help. The figure was tall, dressed in a heavy coat that looked old, almost out of date. The man's face was partially obscured by the shadow of his hat, but Liam could make out a fixed, penetrating gaze. Liam hesitated for a moment. It was late at night, and stories about strange encounters on deserted roads came to mind. However, he couldn't ignore the apparent call for help. He slowed down and stopped the car a few meters from the man. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" Liam asked as he opened the window. The man didn't answer. He just stood there, motionless, with the flashlight flickering in his hand. Something in the prolonged silence made the hairs on the back of Liam's neck stand on end. He felt a pang of growing discomfort. "Sir," Liam insisted. Suddenly, the torchlight went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. Liam blinked, trying to adjust his vision to the lack of light, but when he looked again at where the man had been, he had disappeared. There was no sign of him on the road or in the surrounding fields. A shiver ran down Liam's spine. He swallowed and decided he'd better get out of there. He turned on the high beams to check his surroundings again before speeding up and driving away. His heart was racing as he tried to rationalize what had happened. Perhaps it was just his imagination playing tricks on him, or a trick of the light in the mist. However, a few minutes later, something even stranger happened. While driving along the lonely road, he noticed a faint glow coming from the back seat of the car through the rearview mirror. At first, he thought it was the reflection of the headlights or some reflective object he had left there earlier. But then the light started flashing, intermittently and irregularly, just like the flashlight the man had been holding moments before on the road. Liam froze. Sweat began to trickle down his forehead as he looked repeatedly through the rearview mirror, trying to understand what was happening. He hadn't left anything in the back seat that could emit light, and there was definitely no one there when he got into the car. Suddenly, a low, hoarse laugh echoed inside the vehicle. It was a guttural and disturbing sound, as if someone was mocking him directly in his ear. Liam felt every fiber of his body panic as he gripped the steering wheel tightly. "Who's there?" he shouted in desperation, not daring to look back again. The laughter stopped as abruptly as it started. The flashing light disappeared, leaving only deafening silence and darkness around the car. Liam accelerated like never before, trying to escape that suffocating feeling of being watched by something invisible and evil. When he finally reached the nearest town and parked under the bright lights of a busy gas station, he mustered the courage to look into the back seat. There was nothing there, no flashlight, no presence, but on the upholstery there were deep marks as if long fingers had scratched the fabric repeatedly. While trying to process what had happened, Liam was approached by an elderly gas station attendant who had worked there for decades. Noticing the young driver's shaken state, he asked, "Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Liam hesitated before answering. "I don't know. Maybe I did see something like that." The attendant frowned and looked at the car curiously. "Did you come up the old road, the one near the hill?" Liam nodded slowly. "Ah, so you found the Lantern Man." The gas station attendant's deep tone made Liam's hair stand on end again. "Who is this man?" asked Liam, trying to sound skeptical despite his growing fear. The attendant sighed before answering. "They say that many years ago there was an accident on that road during a terrible storm. A local farmer was returning home with his lantern when his car skidded on the bend and fell into the ravine. He died before anyone could help him. Since then, some people swear they see him asking for help by the side of the road on the darkest nights." Liam felt his hands shaking as he listened to the story. He wanted to believe that it was all just a coincidence or a vivid imagination caused by tiredness. But the marks on the back seat were too real to ignore. That night, when he got home, Liam locked all the doors and windows before trying to sleep. But he still had nightmares about sinister laughter and flashing lights in the dark room. Since then, he has never driven alone on country roads at night, especially those shrouded in dense fog where mysterious figures may be waiting for the next soul willing to stop and help. 2. The submerged road. It was a grey and oppressive afternoon on the outskirts of Cardiff, Wales. The torrential rain that had been falling for days had turned the country roads into treacherous traps, with deep puddles and mud covering the asphalt. Dylan, a delivery man who needed to complete his last delivery of the day, was determined to make his way along a road known for being faster, although often advised against in times of rain. The sky seemed to weigh down on him as he drove. The windshield wipers worked frantically, but could barely keep up with the intensity of the water coming down. The trees along the road swayed violently in the wind, and the sound of the rain hammering the roof of the car was almost deafening. Dylan gripped the steering wheel tightly, his fingers white with tension. When he reached the entrance to the side road, he hesitated. The road was partially flooded. The water flowed slowly over the asphalt, forming a shallow river that reflected the dark sky above. He knew he should turn around and look for a safer route, but he was running late and didn't want to face the wrath of his boss again. He took a deep breath and decided to keep going. "It's just some water," he muttered to himself, trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling in his stomach. At first, it seemed manageable. The water was only up to the wheels of the car, and Dylan drove slowly, on the lookout for any sign of danger. But as he drove on, he noticed that the current was getting stronger. The water was now licking the vehicle's headlights and causing the car to sway slightly. "Damn," he whispered as he considered turning back. But something on the road ahead caught his eye. There were indistinct shapes in the water, like shadows floating just below the surface. Dylan blinked several times, thinking his eyes were playing tricks on him. Perhaps they were branches or debris carried by the current. He tried to ignore it and kept moving forward slowly, but then the shadows began to move against the current. Dylan's heart raced. He squinted to try to see better through the soaked windshield. The shapes looked human. Arms and legs moving slowly, as if they were swimming or floating in the murky water. There was something deeply wrong with them. Their movements were clumsy, almost robotic, and their outlines were blurred, as if they didn't quite belong in that world. One of them partially emerged from the water right in front of the car. It was a tall, thin figure with pale skin and dark eyes that looked like bottomless wells. She raised an arm towards the car, as if trying to reach it. Dylan screamed and instinctively hit the gas. The car moved with difficulty through the rising water as he tried to escape the terrifying sight. But the figures kept appearing around him. First 2, then 5, then dozens of them. They emerged from the flood as if they were part of it, their translucent bodies glowing faintly in the headlights. With every meter he traveled, Dylan felt the car lose more traction. The water was now almost covering the hood, and the engine was starting to choke. He knew he had to get out of there immediately, or he would be dragged down into the depths along with those things. His hands trembling, he tried to reverse to go back the way he came. But when he looked in the rearview mirror, he saw more figures coming up behind him, blocking his escape route. Some of them were so close that he could see their faces, mouths open in silent screams, and empty eyes that seemed to be begging for something, or perhaps threatening him. "No, this isn't real," Dylan repeated to himself like a mantra as he tried to stay calm. Suddenly, the car came to a complete stop. The engine died with a muffled sound, leaving him stranded in the middle of that submerged road, surrounded by the shadowy figures. The silence that followed was even more frightening than the sound of the rain or the engine failing. The figures slowly began to approach the car. One of them put his hands on the hood and leaned over to look straight through the windshield. Its black eyes met Dylan's, and he felt as if he were being pulled into that infinite void. Desperate, he tried to open the car door to escape on foot, but the force of the water pressed against it with such intensity that it was impossible to move it. He was trapped. It was then that he heard a strange sound coming from underneath the car, a kind of pop followed by a sudden movement. Before he could react, he felt the vehicle being swept away by the current. "No, no," he shouted as he tried unsuccessfully to start the engine again. The figures were now surrounding the car on all sides, touching it with thin, long, claw-like hands while laughing quietly in unison. The laughter was distorted and echoed inside Dylan's mind like a living nightmare. With one last desperate effort, he managed to break the glass of the side window using an emergency tool he kept in the glove compartment. Water flooded inside the car immediately, but he managed to crawl out before it was too late. Dylan struggled against the current as he tried to reach dry land, his legs heavy from the force of the icy water and his lungs burning with effort. When he finally reached the edge of the flooded road, he fell to his knees on the muddy ground and looked back. The car was slowly disappearing under the dark water, along with those sinister figures who still seemed to be watching him from the depths. Dylan could never explain exactly what happened that night, but he vowed never to drive on flooded roads again, especially those where shadows seemed to come to life in the dark waters after a storm. 3. The driverless bus. It was a cold, silent dawn on a deserted highway outside Flagstaff, Arizona. Ethan, a sales representative returning home after a long work trip, was driving alone along endless kilometers of asphalt. The road was shrouded in almost total darkness, except for the headlights of his car and the occasional glow of the moon that appeared between the clouds. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of the engine and the wind cutting through the vehicle. Ethan had driven this route before, but something seemed different that night. The loneliness of the road, combined with the oppressive feeling of isolation, made him feel uncomfortable. He adjusted the radio to try and find a working station, but all he got was static. Sighing, he gave up and continued driving in silence. It was then that he spotted something ahead. At the side of the road, a yellow school bus was parked on the shoulder. The interior lights were on, casting a faint, yellowish glow through the dusty windows. Ethan frowned. It was unusual to see a school bus at that time on such a remote highway. As he got closer, he slowed down to take a closer look. Something in the vehicle seemed out of place. There was no sign of movement or human presence, neither driver nor passengers. The engine was off, but the lights were still on, flashing occasionally as if there was a short circuit. Ethan pulled the car over a few meters behind the bus and stood still for a moment, watching it intently. Something was bothering him deeply about the scene. He thought about getting out of the car to see if anyone needed help, but an inexplicable feeling of alertness came over him. It was then that he noticed the marks on the windows. There were handprints all over the glass, dozens of them, and some seemed to be covered in something dark and slimy that glistened under the bus's interior light. Blood. Ethan swallowed and felt a shiver run down his spine. Whatever had happened there wasn't normal. "It's not my problem," he muttered to himself as he started the car again. He decided to pass the bus and continue on his way, but as he accelerated slightly and passed it on the left, something strange happened. As soon as his car passed in front of the stationary vehicle, the bus's lights flashed brightly before going out completely. Ethan looked in the rearview mirror, confused. The bus was now plunged into total darkness. He tried to ignore it and keep driving, but when he looked in the rearview mirror again, the bus was moving. "What?" Ethan muttered in a shaky voice. The bus was now following behind him on the deserted highway. There was no one behind the wheel. He was sure of it. But the vehicle was moving slowly, as if it were alive on its own. The interior lights had come back on, casting strange shadows across the tarnished windows. Ethan instinctively accelerated, trying to leave the bus behind, but the faster he went, the faster the bus seemed to follow. Now he could hear the sound of the metallic monster's tires humming against the asphalt as it got closer and closer. Ethan's heart was racing as he tried to keep control of the speeding car. He looked through the rearview mirror again and saw something even more disturbing. Shadowy figures began to appear inside the bus. They were indistinct silhouettes, small children with blurred shapes and glowing eyes that seemed to stare straight at him through the bloodied windows. Some banged frantically on the windows as if they were trapped inside. Others just stood there motionless, watching him with blank, penetrating gazes. "This can't be happening," Ethan whispered in a cold sweat. He tried to rationalize it as tiredness or some kind of hallucination caused by the exhaustion of the long journey. But the growing sound of the bus engine behind him made it impossible to ignore the terrifying reality of the situation. Suddenly, the bus's interior lights flashed again, this time so brightly that they illuminated the entire road ahead for a brief moment before going out completely once more. When Ethan looked in the rearview mirror again, the bus had disappeared. He cautiously slowed down, looking all around him at the empty road. There was no sign of the vehicle or the shadowy figures that had been inside it moments before. Only the oppressive darkness of the night remained, but before he could breathe a sigh of relief, he heard a strange sound coming from the roof of his car. Thump, thump, thump. It was as if something heavy was walking on top of the vehicle. Ethan froze in place as he gripped the steering wheel tightly. He didn't dare look up or get out of the car to check what was happening. The sound continued for a few seconds before abruptly ceasing. When he finally gathered the courage to look through the rearview mirror once more, he saw bloody marks on the rear window, just like those on the bus windows. Without a second thought, Ethan hit the gas and drove non-stop until he reached the nearest town at dawn. He never told anyone this story, for fear of being called crazy, but since that night, he has avoided driving alone on deserted highways in the early hours of the morning. And what about the school bus? Some say it still occasionally appears on the region's remote roads, waiting for its next victim, willing to overtake it without knowing what awaits them in the shadows of that cursed vehicle. If you're enjoying the story so far, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel. Not only will this guarantee you more content like this, but it also helps my work a lot. Let's grow this community together. 4. The voice in the GPS. It was a cold, silent night on the outskirts of Inverness, Scotland, when Claire, a young photographer, decided to take a shortcut back to the hotel where she was staying. She had spent the day exploring the Scottish countryside for a photographic project and, exhausted, just wanted to get to her destination as quickly as possible. The road was unknown to her, but Claire had complete faith in her car's GPS. After all, technology had never let her down before. The sky was dark and starless, with heavy clouds that threatened a storm. The road was narrow and lined with dense forests that seemed to swallow up the light from the headlights. The only sound was that of the car's engine and the occasional whistle of the wind against the trees. Claire adjusted the GPS on the dashboard and typed in the address of the hotel. The familiar female voice echoed through the car. Turn right in 500 meters. Claire breathed a sigh of relief. Despite the uneasy atmosphere of the road, she felt safe with the GPS's clear instructions. She followed the directions and turned right onto an even narrower and more secluded path. The trees now seemed closer, their branches bending as if to touch the car. "Keep going for 5 kilometers," said the mechanical voice. She obeyed, but something began to bother her. The road seemed increasingly deserted and poorly maintained. There were no signs, no lights, no sign of civilization, just the growing darkness and the sound of tires crushing wet gravel. After a few minutes, the GPS voice returned. "Turn left in 200 meters. Claire frowned. The map on the screen showed only a thin line representing the main road. There was no indication of any left turn. Nevertheless, she slowed down to look for the supposed crossroads. When he reached the indicated point, he realized that there was no actual road, just a dirt track, barely visible between the trees. "This can't be right," she muttered to herself, but before she could decide what to do, the GPS voice spoke again, this time with a different tone. It was no longer mechanical and neutral, it sounded lower, almost whispery. "Turn left now." Claire felt a shiver run up her spine. Something about the intonation felt wrong, not just strange, but threatening. She hesitated for a moment before deciding to ignore the instruction and continue along the main road. However, as soon as she accelerated to move on, the GPS automatically recalculating, turn left in 100 meters. The insistence was disconcerting. Claire tried to turn off the device, but it didn't respond to her touch on the screen. The voice kept repeating, "Turn left now! Turn left now!" The tone became increasingly low and distorted, as if something was interfering with the system. Claire's heart began to race as she tried to keep calm. "This is just a technical error," she said out loud, trying to convince herself. But then something even stranger happened. The car's interior lights began to flicker slightly, and the radio, which had been switched off, came on by itself, emitting loud, disturbing static. Claire felt her hands sweat as she gripped the steering wheel tightly. Suddenly the voice changed completely. It was no longer feminine or artificial. Now it sounded masculine, husky, and full of malice. "You can't run away. Turn around now." Claire screamed with fright and hit the gas, determined to get off that road as quickly as possible. But the more she drove, the more she felt like she was stuck in the same place. The trees around her looked identical. The kilometers ticked by on the dashboard, but nothing changed in the landscape. The GPS recalculated incessantly, recalculating, and then came another instruction. "Stop the car here." Claire ignored it again, but something began to happen to the vehicle. The engine choked briefly before continuing to run with difficulty. The headlights started flashing as if they were about to go out completely. The voice came back, "You have no choice. Stop now." Desperate, Claire switched off the GPS, yanking it out of the dashboard and throwing it onto the passenger seat. But even though it wasn't connected to the car's electrical system, it was still on, its screen flashing frantically while emitting distorted sounds that sounded like muffled laughter. She looked through the rearview mirror and saw something that made her blood run cold. A dark figure was standing right in the middle of the road behind her. It was tall and indistinct, like a solid shadow with no defined face or shape, but clearly watching her. Claire sped up even more as tears streamed down her face. She didn't know where she was going, or if she would be able to escape this surreal situation, but she knew she had to keep moving. Finally, she spotted a dim light in the distance. It appeared to be a lone street lamp illuminating an intersection ahead. He felt a surge of hope as he drove towards the light with all the speed he could muster. As soon as he reached the illuminated intersection, everything stopped abruptly. The radio turned itself off, the car's lights stabilized, and the GPS finally went silent. When she looked through the rearview mirror again, there was nothing there but the empty road behind her. Claire parked under the street lamp and took several deep breaths before picking up her cell phone to try to locate her position manually on the digital map. To her surprise and horror, she realized that she was exactly where she had started hours ago, as if she had never left that starting point on the road. Since that night, Claire has never again blindly relied on a GPS or any other electronic device during her night drives. And whenever she thinks back to that terrifying moment, she can't help wondering what would have happened if I had obeyed the instructions. 5. The Night Cyclist. It was a cold, silent dawn on a deserted road outside Montauk in New York State. Alex, a young driver returning from a business trip, was driving alone along a highway that seemed endless. The sky was dark, with no moon or stars visible, and the only sound was the constant hum of the car's engine. The road was completely empty, and Alex was already beginning to feel the weight of tiredness. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 2:37 a.m. There was still over an hour to go before he reached his destination. Trying to ward off sleep, he turned on the radio, but found nothing but static. He sighed and switched it off again, resigned to the oppressive silence of the night. Suddenly, something appeared in the headlight's field of vision. A cyclist appeared out of nowhere, pedaling slowly in the middle of the road. Alex only had a few seconds to react. He turned the wheel sharply to swerve, feeling the tires skid slightly on the fog-wet asphalt. "Damn!" he exclaimed as he regained control of the car. His heart was racing as he looked in the rearview mirror. The cyclist was still there, pedaling along as if nothing had happened. Alex took a deep breath and slowed down, trying to understand how someone could be riding a bike in that isolated place and at that time. He thought about stopping to ask if the person needed help, but something about the cyclist's behavior seemed strange. The figure was bent over the bike in an unnatural way, with his shoulders slumped and his head tilted down, as if he wasn't really looking where he was going. His clothes were dark and torn, making it even harder to make out any details. Deciding it was best to move on, Alex accelerated again and left the cyclist behind. But the uncomfortable feeling stayed with him as he continued along the deserted road. A few minutes later, when he was beginning to believe that he had left the incident behind, something caught his eye again. Ahead, illuminated by the car's headlights, was the same cyclist. Alex instinctively slammed on the brakes. It was impossible that it was the same person. He was sure he had left the cyclist far behind just a few minutes ago. Yet there he was again, pedaling slowly down the middle of the road. This time, Alex didn't try to swerve or slow down. He honked his horn repeatedly as he advanced towards the cyclist. "Get out of the way!" he shouted, even though he knew no one could hear him. But the cyclist didn't react. He continued pedaling at the same slow, steady speed, as if oblivious to the presence of the car behind him. When Alex finally managed to overtake him on the right, he looked quickly to the side and felt a shiver run down his spine. The cyclist's face was partially illuminated by the car's headlights. He was pale and expressionless, with deep-set eyes that seemed to stare straight at him without blinking. His mouth was curved into a disturbing smile, a smile that seemed more mocking than friendly. Alex accelerated again, trying to get away from that sinister figure as quickly as possible. But the more he drove, the more he felt as if something was wrong with the road ahead. The trees looked the same. The bends were all too familiar. Even the holes in the asphalt seemed to be in the same place. It was then that he realized he was driving in circles. Before he could fully process what was happening, he saw the silhouette of the cyclist ahead on the road again, this time closer than before. Alex felt his heart racing as he slowed down against his will. "This isn't possible," he muttered to himself. This time, when he passed the cyclist again, something had changed. The disturbing smile was now wider, almost grotesque, and the eyes seemed to follow him as he passed by. Alex broke out in a cold sweat as he tried to find a rational explanation for what was happening. Maybe he was too tired. Maybe he was imagining things, but it all seemed so real, too real to be just the result of exhaustion. He decided to stop the car on the roadside to try to pull himself together and figure out what to do next. He took several deep breaths before looking in the rearview mirror again. But there was no sign of the cyclist behind him this time. For a brief moment, he felt relieved until he heard a strange sound coming from outside the car. Tick, tick, tick. It was low and rhythmic, like the sound of pedals turning slowly. Alex slowly turned to look out of the side window, and there he was, the cyclist, standing next to the car. He was no longer pedaling, he was just staring straight at Alex with that sinister smile on his pale face. Before he could react or even scream, the car's interior lights flashed briefly, and when they returned to normal, the cyclist had disappeared. Without a second thought, Alex started the engine again and sped down the road as if his life depended on it. He didn't know how or why this was happening. All he knew was that he needed to get out of there immediately. When he finally reached the city limits at dawn, he stopped at a busy gas station and got out of the car, shaking. He didn't tell anyone about what had happened that night. But since then, he has avoided driving alone on deserted roads in the early hours of the morning. And what about the cyclist? Some say he still appears on dark nights on isolated highways, waiting for unwary drivers to cross his path. 6. Music in the mist. It was a cold, damp dawn on the outskirts of Wiltshire in England. The winding road was shrouded in a thick fog, so dense that the headlights of Thomas's car could barely illuminate a few meters ahead. He was returning home from a long work meeting in another city, and although he was tired, the discomfort caused by the oppressive atmosphere of the road kept him alert. The silence inside the car was absolute. The radio was off, and all he could hear was the sound of the tires sliding smoothly over the wet asphalt and the occasional snap of trees swaying in the wind. The mist seemed to swallow up everything around, leaving Thomas with the feeling that he was driving through an infinite void. It was then that he heard it for the first time. A soft, almost imperceptible melody reached his ears. It was difficult to identify where it was coming from. It seemed to be far away, floating through the mist like a whisper. He frowned and turned down the volume on the car's fan to hear it better. The music was strange, something between a melancholy lament and an old waltz. There was something unsettling about its slow, hypnotic cadence. Thomas shook his head, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling. It must be my imagination, he thought. Maybe he was too tired, or maybe some distant radio was playing in a nearby house. He tried to ignore the music and focus on the road, but the melody didn't go away. In fact, it seemed to get closer. With every kilometer he drove, it got a little louder, clearer, more present. Thomas began to feel a slight chill on the back of his neck as he looked around, trying to locate the source of the sound. But all he could see was the dense fog covering the fields around the road. He picked up speed, anxious to leave that stretch behind. But the faster he went, the louder the music got, now so clear that it sounded like he was inside the car. Thomas looked at the radio panel, but it was off. Even so, the melody continued to echo through the interior of the vehicle, filling every corner with its disturbing presence. He felt his heart race as he gripped the steering wheel tightly. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered to himself. Then something caught his eye out of the corner of his eye. In the rearview mirror, he saw indistinct shapes moving in the mist behind the car. They were vague shadows at first, but as he looked more closely, he realized that they were human figures, men and women dancing slowly to the music that now seemed to dominate the room. They spun around in pairs, as if they were in an invisible ballroom in the middle of the deserted road. Their movements were elegant, but there was something deeply wrong with them. Their bodies seemed distorted by the mist, as if they weren't completely solid. And although they were dancing happily, their faces, when visible, were frozen in empty, lifeless expressions. Thomas felt a shiver run through his entire body. He looked away from the rearview mirror and tried to concentrate on the road ahead, but the music kept growing in intensity, now so loud that it seemed to vibrate inside his head. "It's not happening! It's not happening!" he repeated like a mantra as he sped up even more. But the figures hadn't disappeared. On the contrary, they were now all around the car. Thomas could vaguely see them through the side windows, silhouettes spinning and swaying like puppets caught in a macabre dance. Some seemed to stare directly at him as they danced, their empty eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Desperate to escape the surreal situation, Thomas hit the gas. The engine roared as the car sped through the mist like a bullet fired into the void. But even so, the music continued, loud and relentless, and the figures seemed to follow him effortlessly. It was then that he heard something even more disturbing, muffled laughter mixed in with the melody. They were soft, distorted laughs that seemed to mock him as he tried to escape. Finally, after what seemed like hours of absolute terror, Thomas spotted lights in the distance, street lamps illuminating an intersection ahead. He felt a wave of relief wash over him as he drove towards the lights with all the speed he could muster. As soon as he crossed the boundary illuminated by the nearest lamppost, everything came to an abrupt halt. The music ceased, the figures disappeared, and silence once again dominated the surroundings. Thomas parked on the roadside under the bright lights and took several deep breaths before looking through the rearview mirror again. There was nothing there but the empty road plunged into mist behind him. He stood there for a few minutes trying to process what had just happened before finally starting the engine again and driving on to the safety of his hotel. Since that night, Thomas has never driven alone on fog-covered roads at dawn, especially ones where a distant melody might start playing, because he knows that not all music is meant to be heard by the living. 7. The changing plate. It was a dark, moonless night on a deserted highway in rural Colorado. Michael, an experienced traveler, was driving alone, trying to shorten the distance to the next gas station. He was used to long night journeys and always relied on his ability to navigate roads with little traffic. However, something seemed different that night. The road was quieter than usual, and the surrounding darkness was almost suffocating. The clock on the dashboard read 1:43 a.m. when he spotted the first sign. It was a simple sign, but worn by time and exposure to the weather. The faded white letters read, "Danger, road closed." Michael frowned. He had driven this stretch before and knew that there were no records of recent roadworks or closures. Road closed. It can't be, he muttered to himself, slowing the car down. He looked around, but saw nothing to justify the warning. No signaling cone, no barrier, no detour. Just the straight road stretching ahead, illuminated by his car's headlights. He decided to ignore the sign and drive on. As he advanced, the silence seemed to grow. The sound of the car's engine echoed in the vastness of the night, and Michael began to feel a slight discomfort. A sensation that was hard to explain, as if he were being watched. He shook his head to clear away the paranoid thoughts and continued driving. It was then that he saw another sign. This one was newer, with large, clear letters that looked as if they had just been painted. It read, "Come back now." Michael felt a shiver run down his spine. He slowed down again and looked around through the car window. There was still nothing but the empty road and the shadows of the trees in the distance. He tried to laugh to himself. "This must be some kind of prank or vandalism," he said aloud, trying to sound confident. But something about the clarity of that sign seemed personal. It seemed to be there just for him. Michael hesitated for a moment before stepping on the accelerator again. He didn't believe in superstitions or strange coincidences. He was a practical, rational man. He would keep driving until he found something concrete to explain those messages. Just a few minutes later, another sign appeared on the side of the road. This time, the words were even more disturbing. "You have been warned." Michael's heart began to beat faster. He felt his hands sweat as he gripped the steering wheel tighter. The road seemed endless now, a dark tunnel that pulled him deeper and deeper into something unknown. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to himself, although his voice trembled slightly. But then came the next sign. It was positioned right in the middle of the road, forcing him to stop the car completely to read the words painted in bright red. "Michael, come back before it's too late." He froze in place. His eyes widened as he read his own name on the sign. It was impossible. No one knew he would be there that night. No one could have prepared this in advance. "How?" he whispered, looking around frantically. The darkness seemed more oppressive now, as if it were closing in around the car. He felt his breathing quicken as he tried to find a logical explanation for what was happening. Determined to put an end to it once and for all, Michael got out of the car and walked over to the sign in the middle of the road. He touched it with trembling hands. It was real, made of solid wood with fresh paint still shining under the car's headlights. Suddenly, a strange sound echoed across the road, a low whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Michael turned quickly in the direction of the sound, but saw nothing but darkness around him. When he looked at the sign again, the words had changed. It now read, "It's too late." Michael instinctively backed away, tripping over his own feet as he ran back to his car. He hurried inside and locked the doors before starting the engine again. Stepping hard on the accelerator, he drove as fast as he could down the deserted road. But the signs kept appearing in front of him as if they were being placed there instantly by some invisible force. "You can't run away. You're getting close. Look in the rearview mirror." Michael hesitated for a moment before obeying the last warning, and wished he hadn't looked. In the rearview mirror, he saw something coming up behind him on the road. A tall, indistinct shadow that seemed to glide across the asphalt without making a sound. It had no definite shape, but its contours pulsed as if they were made of smoke or living darkness. He screamed and accelerated even more, his eyes fixed on the road ahead as he tried to ignore the growing presence behind him. Finally, after what seemed like hours of absolute terror, he spotted lights in the distance, street lamps illuminating an area near the entrance to a small town. As soon as he crossed the boundary illuminated by the first post, everything came to an abrupt halt. The signs disappeared, the sound ceased, and when he looked in the rearview mirror again, there was nothing there but the empty road behind him. Michael parked on the roadside under the bright lights and took several deep breaths before leaning his head against the steering wheel. He could never explain exactly what happened that night, but since then he has avoided driving alone on deserted highways in the early hours of the morning, especially those where signs seem to know more about you than they should. And those were the 7 horror stories involving driving alone at night on the road. So, what did you think? Which one was the scariest in your opinion? Tell us in the comments. If you liked the video and want to see more content like this, don't forget to like it and share it with your friends. It really helps the channel grow. See you next time.